The conference room fell silent after Martin Caldwell slid the final document across the polished oak table. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for it, but he already knew. The trust amendment had been activated the moment he attempted to coerce me into signing away control of my estate. The clause Walter had hidden there 23 years earlier was merciless in its precision. Any heir proven to manipulate, intimidate, or deceive a surviving spouse for financial gain forfeited every inheritance right immediately. Every account Daniel believed he would control was frozen from his reach. Every property interest reverted solely to me. And the development loan he and Melissa had secretly leveraged against future inheritance? It collapsed the moment the bank received notice that their collateral claim was void. I watched the color drain from my son's face as the banker confirmed his investment partners had already been informed. Melissa tried to speak, tried to blame a misunderstanding, but Martin calmly placed a second folder on the table. Copies of diverted funds. Forged authorization attempts. Emails they believed had been erased. Their quiet scheme was no longer private family betrayal. It was evidence. Melissa's name was removed from the charity board she had spent years climbing into. Daniel's firm suspended him pending fraud review before the week was over. Friends who once admired them stopped returning calls. Their country club memberships vanished. Their reputation, so carefully polished, cracked in a single afternoon under the weight of truth. Daniel looked at me then not as a son asking forgiveness, but as a man realizing he had mistaken kindness for weakness. "Mom, please," he whispered, and for the first time in years I heard fear in his voice. I folded my gloves, stood, and looked him straight in the eye. "You said you needed my signature, not my opinion," I told him. "What you failed to understand is that my signature built everything you wanted to take." Then I signed one final document, not theirs.
Meaning?
The papers establishing the Harper Family Foundation in my husband's name, funded with the assets they tried to steal, dedicated to widows. Facing financial exploitation. The house remained mine. The land remained mine. The company's shares remained under my control. And Daniel was written out of every succession instrument before sunset. When I walked out of that building, Martin asked if I felt sorrow. I told him no. Sorrow had ended the day my son treated me like a signature instead of a mother. What I felt now was clarity. 3 months later, I hosted Thanksgiving in the same dining room where Daniel once slid those papers toward me. The mahogany table was full again, but not with people who measured love in dollar signs. At the head of the table, beneath Walter's portrait, I raised a glass and understood something profound. Betrayal may wound a family, but truth decides who keeps the legacy. Daniel sent letters. I never answered. Melissa tried rebuilding her image. It never recovered. Their punishment was not my anger. It was living with what greed had cost them. And me? I was never more powerful than the day I refused to sign away my voice. They came for my signature. They lost their future. I made one phone call to my lawyer and took back everything. "We need your signature, not your opinion, Mom." My son said it so casually he might have been asking me to pass the salt. For a moment, even the grandfather clock in my dining room seemed to stop ticking. Daniel sat at the far end of the mahogany table his father had refinished with his own hands 30 years ago, a stack of legal papers aligned neatly before him. Melissa sat beside him, fingers wrapped around a coffee cup, eyes fixed on me with that patient little smile she wore when she believed she had already won. Outside, rain tapped against the kitchen window in a slow rhythm, and the smell of pot roast still lingered from dinner. It should have been an ordinary Sunday. It was the day I understood my family had been preparing to take something from me. I looked down at the documents he had slid across the table. Signature tabs marked in yellow. Pages dense with legal language. My reading glasses rested beside my untouched tea, but I did not reach for them. At 72, widowhood had taught me the value of silence. People reveal themselves when they think you're stunned. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "It's just estate planning," he said. "Routine. Routine." Such a harmless word. Yet his voice held the impatience of a man already counting what was not his. Melissa finally spoke. "It's easier if we handle things now while you're comfortable." She paused before the last word, as though searching for one kinder than competent enough to resist them. I folded my hands in my lap, so they would not see them tighten. Since Walter died 18 months earlier, the house had changed in ways too subtle to accuse and too sharp to ignore. Rooms once filled with warmth now carried whispers that stopped when I entered. Locks had been changed under the excuse of security. Bank statements arrived opened. Conversations lowered when I walked in. Small things. Dismissible things. Until that moment at my own table, when my son reduced me to a signature line. "What exactly am I signing?" I asked. Daniel exhaled through his nose, already irritated. "Mom, it's complicated. Trust me." I almost smiled at that. Trust me. The favorite phrase of those planning betrayal. I lifted one page and saw enough to feel cold move through my chest. Transfer of decision authority. Durable powers. Language about property oversight. They thought grief had softened my judgment. They mistook mourning for confusion. I set the papers down very carefully. "I'll have my lawyer review these." Daniel laughed once, too quickly. "You don't need a lawyer." That was when I looked at him fully. Really looked. The restless tapping of his ring finger. The sweat darkening his collar. Melissa's silence becoming brittle. There was urgency here. Need. Not concern. And in that instant, beneath the old hurt only a mother can carry, something steadier rose in me. My husband had once said over morning coffee, "If family ever pressures you to sign in haste, Evelyn, slow everything down." The guilty hate delay. I heard his voice as clearly as if he sat beside me. So I nodded. Softly. Almost meekly. "Maybe tomorrow," I said. Relief flashed across Daniel's face. He thought he had moved me 1 inch from surrender. He did not know that later that night, after they drove away, I would climb the attic stairs, open Walter's cedar lockbox, and find the sealed envelope he told me never to touch unless my own blood turned against me. The attic smelled of cedar, old paper, and winter dust. I had not climbed those narrow stairs since Walter died, not because I feared the memories, but because grief has a way of making even familiar doors feel heavy. I carried a flashlight, though the pull chain still worked. Habit, perhaps. Or caution. The cedar lockbox sat where he had left it, beneath a stack of army records and Christmas ornaments wrapped in yellowing tissue. My hands trembled as I lifted the brass latch. Inside were documents arranged with the same deliberate neatness Walter brought to everything he touched. Insurance records. Property deeds. A worn envelope with my name in his handwriting. And beneath it, another marked, "Open only if family mistakes kindness for weakness." I sat on an old trunk and stared at those words for a long time. Rain beat harder against the roof. Somewhere below, the refrigerator hummed in the quiet house. It felt as though time had narrowed to that attic and the envelope in my lap. Walter had always believed danger did not announce itself loudly. It arrived politely. In paperwork. In favors. In people smiling while they reached for what was yours. I opened the letter carefully. His voice rose from the page as if no time had passed. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, someone close to you has confused inheritance with entitlement. Do not panic." I prepared for that possibility. In the bottom compartment is the Caldwell file. Trust Martin. Tell no one until you know their motives. My breath caught. Bottom compartment. I ran my fingers along the cedar lining until I felt the hidden seam. It opened with a soft click. Inside lay a slim leather folder and a key attached to a faded bank tag. Caldwell. Martin Caldwell. Walter's attorney for 40 years. I had not spoken to him since the funeral. I opened the folder and found trust instruments far older than the papers Daniel had pushed toward me. Handwritten notes in Walter's margin. Protective clauses. Contingencies. One phrase circled in blue ink. Made me go still. Coercive conduct by any heir triggers forfeiture. I read it twice. Then again. The room seemed colder, though perhaps it was only realization settling into my bones. Daniel had not come to help me organize my affairs. He had walked into a structure my husband had anticipated long before either of us saw the danger. Yet beneath the strange comfort of that discovery was another feeling. Shame. Not because my son had deceived me, but because some part of me had sensed it and still wanted to excuse him. Mothers do that. We soften hard truths until they wound us. I folded Walter's letter and held it against my chest. Then I did something I had not done in months. I laughed. Quietly. Not from joy. From recognition. They thought they were introducing me to strategy. Walter had lived inside strategy. The next morning, before sunrise, I drove 12 miles into town through mist hanging low over the fields and parked outside Caldwell and Pierce, attorneys at law. The brass plaque looked unchanged from 20 years ago. Martin himself opened the door when I arrived. His silver brows lifted when he saw the folder in my hands. He did not ask why I had come. He only stepped aside and said, "I was wondering when Walter's insurance policy would walk through that door." I knew then this was larger than hidden clauses and suspicious papers. My husband had left me more than protection. He had left me a trap for anyone who mistook an old woman for easy prey. Martin Caldwell did not waste words. He closed his office door, poured 2 cups of black coffee, and spread the trust documents across a walnut conference table worn smooth by decades of quiet wars. Morning light fell through the blinds in narrow bands across the paper. He adjusted his glasses and began reading line by line, the way surgeons must study an image before touching a blade. I watched his expression more than the pages. Twice he gave a slow nod. Once he made a note in the margin. Then he leaned back and folded his hands. "Your husband built layers," he said. "Most people create trusts to pass down wealth. Walter created one to test character." He turned a page toward me and tapped a paragraph buried. In legal language, no ordinary reader would notice. It was the forfeiture provision. If any heir attempted to pressure, mislead, or manipulate a surviving spouse into transferring authority or assets under coercive conditions, their inheritance rights could be suspended pending review. Suspended. Such a quiet word for a financial earthquake. I felt my throat tighten. "Daniel does not know this exists?" I asked. Martin gave the faintest smile. "If he knew, he would not have brought you those papers." Then he opened the documents Daniel wanted me to sign. My stomach turned as he compared them. "This is not routine estate planning," he said. "This transfers broad decision authority to your son. Property, accounts, investment discretion." He looked up. Once signed, it would have been difficult to reverse. Difficult. Another lawyer's word carrying the weight of disaster. I stared at the pages Daniel called simple paperwork and remembered how impatient he had sounded when I asked questions. Not nervous, a son protecting his mother. Nervous, a man rushing a deadline. Martin seemed to read my thoughts. "There is urgency on their side," he said. "That can be useful." Useful. Until that moment I had thought in terms of defense. Martin was thinking in terms of exposure. He closed the file. "Do nothing sudden. Let them believe you are uncertain, perhaps even persuadable." I almost laughed. At 72, I was being taught to play weak. Women my age have played weak for generations while carrying families on their backs. What would Walter do? I asked. Martin answered, without hesitation. He would let a dishonest man take one step too far. Those words settled over me like steel. We spent 2 hours building silence into a strategy. I would not refuse Daniel outright. I would agree to a formal signing later in the week. At the bank, under witnesses. Martin would attend unannounced. If Daniel pushed altered authority forms under pressure, the coercion clause could be triggered with evidence. A trap not sprung by accusation, but by his own appetite. Before I left, Martin opened a separate file I had not noticed. Loan records tied to a speculative land venture in Daniel's name. Personal guarantees. Short maturity dates. "He may be more desperate than you know," he said. As I drove home past bare cornfields and gas stations shimmering in afternoon heat, I understood something painful. This was no misunderstanding fueled by Melissa. My son had not drifted into bad judgment. He had built a plan. Yet grief had changed shape inside me. It no longer felt like sorrow. It felt like attention. When I pulled into my driveway, Daniel's truck was already there. Melissa stood on the porch holding a lemon pie, smiling too brightly. "We thought we would stop by," she said. "See how you were feeling about the paperwork." I smiled back and heard Martin's words in my mind. Let a dishonest man take one step too far. I have been thinking, I said, opening the door. I believe I am ready to sign Friday. The relief that flashed between them was quick, almost invisible, but I saw it. And for the first time since Walter died, I knew I was no longer the one walking into a trap. For the next 2 days, I played the role they had written for me. I asked harmless questions. I let pauses hang as though I were uncertain. I even called Daniel Wednesday afternoon and asked whether I should bring identification to the bank on Friday, letting just enough frailty touch my voice to satisfy whatever picture he carried of an aging widow growing dependent. Just bring yourself, Mom, he said too quickly. We will handle the rest. We. It was always we now. Never you. Never family. A small word can reveal a shifting allegiance. Thursday evening, Melissa arrived alone with a casserole, her usual performance of concern polished almost beyond detection. She set the dish on my kitchen counter and walked through the house complimenting things she had long stopped noticing. The china cabinet, the Persian rug, Walter's antique clock. Her eyes lingered on objects the way investors study assets. While she talked about holiday plans and grandchildren I no longer saw enough, I watched her study me for signs of doubt. You seem calmer, she said, stirring her tea. I know these legal matters can be confusing. I smiled into my cup. Confusing. Such elegant condescension. At my age, I said softly, one learns to let younger people help. The relief in her face came and went in a blink, but I caught it. She believed the old woman was surrendering. That night after she left, I walked room to room, switching off lamps the way Walter used to, one pool of light at a time disappearing into shadow. Memory moved differently now. It was no longer only grief. It was instruction. I remembered Walter balancing the checkbook at this very table, telling Daniel as a boy that character reveals itself fastest when money enters a room. I had laughed then, called him suspicious. He said suspicion was simply attention with a bad reputation. In the bedroom, I opened the cedar box again and reread his letter. This time another line struck me. If betrayal comes, do not answer hurt with outrage. Answer it with structure. That was Walter. Even vengeance, if one could call it that, had to wear a necktie. Friday morning dawned cold and bright, the kind of Midwestern morning where frost clings silver to mailbox posts. I dressed in navy wool, pinned on the pearl brooch Walter gave me on our 40th anniversary, and drove myself to First National Bank 10 minutes early. Daniel and Melissa were already there in a private conference room with a young loan officer and a notary. Too many witnesses for simple estate planning. That alone told its own story. Daniel stood when I entered, all rehearsed warmth. There she is, he said, touching my elbow as if guiding someone fragile. On the polished table sat the same packet, thicker now, tabs marking signature lines. Melissa had brought pastries no one touched. The loan officer kept glancing at his watch. Urgency again. It moved through the room like static. Daniel began explaining where I should sign, skipping pages and clusters. This section is routine, he said. This one just authorizes management flexibility. His pen hovered over the first line. I reached for my glasses slowly, deliberately. Then the conference room door opened. Martin Caldwell stepped in carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the mild expression of a man arriving exactly where he expected to be. Silence hit the room so sharply, even the notary stopped. Breathing for a moment, Daniel half rose from his chair. What is he doing here? He asked. I placed my hand over the unsigned papers and answered with more calm than I had felt in months. Making sure no one handles the rest for me. And as Daniel's face tightened, I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not irritation this time. Fear. Martin set his briefcase on the table with almost ceremonial calm, as though he had stepped into a routine appointment instead of a room where deception had just begun to unravel. The young loan officer looked from Daniel to Martin and back again, suddenly uncertain who held authority. That uncertainty was the first crack. Martin removed his glasses, unfolded a document, and spoke in the measured tone of a man used to being obeyed without raising his voice. Before Mrs. Harper signs anything, he said, We need clarification as to why a durable transfer authority packet has been presented under the label of estate maintenance. Daniel forced a laugh too thin to sound natural. This is family business. Martin did not even look at him.
No, son.
This is fiduciary business. I had never seen Daniel spoken to that way.
His jaw tightened.
Melissa reached for the papers as if rearranging them might restore control. But Martin had already begun turning pages, pointing out clauses Daniel had rushed me past. Authority to liquidate investment holdings. Right to alter beneficiary distributions. Authority to encumber property. Encumber. Such a cold legal word for putting a widow's home at risk. The notary lowered her pen. The loan officer cleared his throat. Mr. Harper, he said carefully, were these powers discussed with your mother in advance? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, silence was not protecting him. It was exposing him. Martin slid another file across the table. And while we are clarifying, he said, perhaps we should address the personal guarantees tied to the Prairie Ridge development. Melissa turned pale before Daniel did. I saw it instantly. She knew. Daniel stared as though he had been struck by invisible weather. How do you know about that? He asked. Martin folded his hands. Because your proposed collateral assumptions rely in part on assets you do not control. The room changed in that moment. Up until then, Daniel believed this was a difficult signing. Suddenly, he understood it was an examination. I said nothing. I simply watched the shape of truth corner him. He tried to recover. Claimed he had only meant to simplify matters. Claimed Melissa encouraged prudence. Claimed I misunderstood. But desperation has a smell, and once it enters a room, everyone senses it. Martin then did something even I had not expected. He requested the bank suspend the session pending review under the protective terms of the Harper Trust. The loan officer agreed at once. Just like that, the signing was over before a single pen touched paper. Melissa leaned toward Daniel and whispered too sharply for privacy. I told you we should have waited. A marital secret escaped in panic. There it was. Not misunderstanding. Planning. Daniel stood abruptly. Mom, do not let him poison this. I looked at my son and felt something inside me settle, almost peacefully. No one poisoned this, Daniel, I said. It was already rotten. He flinched as though the truth landed physically. Martin gathered the unsigned papers and placed them into his briefcase. This matter is not finished, he said, carrying the careful humility of a man rehearsing regret. Mom, I handled things badly, he said. Melissa, and I want to make this right. I stood at the kitchen sink watching frost melt along the backyard fence while he spoke. There was too much polish in every word. True remorse limps. This arrived in dress shoes. He invited me to dinner Friday, just family, no paperwork, no pressure. I agreed at once. Too quickly, perhaps. I wanted him to think relief had made me careless. Martin had warned me cornered people move in two directions. Retreat or overreach. By Wednesday, we knew which Daniel had chosen. Martin called me before noon. He filed an emergency amendment request with a trust administrator, he said. He is attempting to portray you as cognitively declining. I sat down so hard the chair scraped tile. For a moment the room blurred. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because betrayal had crossed into something colder. To challenge a mother's judgment in order to seize control was not greed and panic. It was strategy stripped bare. Martin's voice remained steady. He just triggered Walter's clause. I closed my eyes and saw my husband's handwriting in blue ink. Coercive conduct. Forfeiture. The words no longer looked theoretical. They had awakened. Martin instructed me to do nothing outwardly. Attend the dinner.
Be warm.
Be unsuspecting. Let Daniel continue believing his petition remained hidden. So Friday evening I drove to their house carrying pecan pie and wearing the same pearl brooch Walter loved. Melissa opened the door with theatrical affection. Candlelight glowed in the dining room. Good china out. Roast chicken. Crystal glasses. A family tableau so perfect it almost mocked itself. Daniel poured wine and talked too much, another sign of nerves. About real estate markets. About grandchildren's school plans. about how important family trust was. That word again.
Trust.
I nearly admired the irony. Then midway through dinner, he excused himself to take a call and left his phone beside his plate. It lit up. Just once. But enough. On the screen, a message preview. Guardianship petition draft ready for filing Monday. My fork stilled against the plate.
I
Looked away before Melissa returned from the kitchen. I did not need more proof. Only timing. When dessert came, Daniel reached across the table and covered my hand. Mom, we have only ever wanted to protect you. His touch felt like theater. I smiled the way women smile when they have heard a lie too often to be moved by it. I know, I said. And in that moment, he mistook composure for surrender one final time. Sunday, Martin and I met in his office. He had prepared the formal notice triggering forfeiture review and a secondary filing regarding attempted undue influence. Yet there was more. The Prairie Ridge investors, alerted by the bank pause, had begun asking questions about Daniel's collateral representations. Pressure was building from directions he did not even see. He is unraveling on multiple fronts, Martin said, which makes him dangerous. Or careless. Monday morning, before Daniel could file his guardianship petition, Martin filed first. The trust protections activated. Accounts under dispute were frozen. And a hearing date was set. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt the strange sadness of seeing your child walk toward ruin, carrying his own shovel. But by Tuesday afternoon, Daniel arrived at my front door unannounced, face drawn, asking if we could talk privately. In his hand was a folder.
thick, creased.
Desperate. I let him in. And what he placed on my kitchen table next would prove the scheme reached far beyond anything even Martin had uncovered. Daniel stood in my kitchen, holding the folder against his chest, as though it contained a confession too heavy to carry alone. The afternoon light through the curtains made him look older than 45, the lines around his mouth suddenly visible in ways I had not noticed when I was busy believing a mother's love could excuse almost anything. I motioned for him to sit. He did not. He placed the folder on the table instead and pushed it toward me with both hands. "Before Martin destroys me," he said quietly, "there is something you need to know." I did not touch the folder at first. I watched him. Men lie most clearly when rushing. Men tell fragments of truth when frightened enough. "Open it," he
said.
Inside were partnership statements, loan calls, investor letters. Numbers circled in red. Deadlines missed. Exposure amounts larger than I imagined. Prairie Ridge was not merely struggling. It was collapsing. And woven through the pages were transfers routed through holding accounts Melissa had managed. I looked up slowly. "She moved money without telling you?" Daniel gave a bitter laugh. "I thought I was using her to protect the deal. Turns out she was protecting herself." There it was. The second fracture. Greed rarely stays loyal to itself. Daniel began talking too fast, as though speed could outrun consequence. Melissa had diverted development reserves into side ventures. Personal guarantees had been secured using projected inheritance he assumed he would control once I signed. The guardianship petition, he admitted, was leveraged to force settlement before investors discovered the collateral gap. I listened without interruption. It was strange. Months earlier, hearing such betrayal might have shattered me. Now it sharpened things. I asked only one question. "Why bring this to me now?" He looked at the floor. "Because Melissa has been preparing to blame everything on me." I almost smiled at the brutal symmetry. The son who thought he could outmaneuver his mother had been outmaneuvered in his own marriage. But pity did not erase what he had done. He reached across the table. "If you withdraw the trust action, I can fix this." There was the old instinct again. Not repentance. Negotiation. I folded the documents closed. "No, Daniel," I said. "You are only just beginning to see what needs fixing." He left shortly after, shoulders bent in a way I had never seen on him before. When the door shut, I called Martin. By evening, he was at my dining table reviewing the folder under a brass reading lamp. His expression hardened as he reached the transfer ledgers. "This changes everything," he said. Attempted coercion was one matter. Misrepresentation tied to investor funds is another. He tapped a series of wire instructions. Melissa may have exposed both of them far beyond trust law. The hearing 2 weeks later no longer looked like a family dispute. It looked like an unraveling. News traveled quietly but quickly in towns like ours. A board member from Melissa's charity resigned before the hearing date. One of Daniel's partners requested indemnity review. Doors were beginning to close before any judge spoke a word. Yet what struck me most came the night before the hearing, when Daniel called after midnight. His voice was hollow. "She left," he said. Melissa moved out. Silence followed. Then, almost in a whisper, "She took files." I sat in darkness holding the phone, hearing not the powerful son who once pushed papers toward me, but a man realizing betrayal has a taste when served back to you. At the courthouse the next morning, Melissa arrived separately with her own attorney. She did not sit beside Daniel. She did not look at him. Martin leaned toward me and murmured, "Watch carefully. When accomplices start protecting themselves, truth comes out in chunks." I did watch. And when Melissa was called to testify, the first words out of her mouth turned the room colder than winter. Melissa adjusted her gloves before taking the witness chair, a small gesture of composure that fooled no one. The courtroom was modest, oak-paneled, with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the smell of old paper drifting through the stillness. Yet when she began to speak, the room felt narrower, as if truth itself required less space than lies. Her attorney asked simple questions at first, trying to cast her as a concerned daughter-in-law navigating financial confusion. But under Martin's cross-examination, the surface split. He moved slowly, almost kindly, which made every answer harder for her to escape. He introduced wire transfers from reserve accounts she controlled. Emails suggesting Daniel believed certain funds remained untouched when they had already been moved. Then he placed before her a memo she had written 6 months earlier discussing what she called accelerating estate access before liquidity pressure worsens. I watched her face change as she recognized her own words. She tried saying it was hypothetical planning. Martin asked whether hypothetical planning usually involved hidden accounts in another state. Silence. The judge leaned forward. And then Melissa made the mistake fear often makes for people. She tried saving herself by offering more than she was asked. "Daniel knew some of it," she said quickly. "But not all of it. Some of it." Those 3 words seemed to drain the blood from my son's face. He turned toward her as though betrayal still surprised him. I did not look at him. I looked at the woman who had entered my family, smiling at Thanksgiving dinners while building exit routes in secret. Martin pressed further. Had she discussed challenging my competency as leverage?
Yes.
Had she prepared alternate narratives for investors suggesting I was voluntarily transferring support?
Yes.
Had Daniel known about offshore placements tied to diverted reserves? Her pause answered before her mouth did.
No.
A murmur moved through the gallery. It was not scandal people reacted to. It was naked treachery. Even greed has rules among conspirators, and she had broken those too. By recess, the judge had ordered expanded review into financial representations beyond the trust matter. Daniel sat alone at counsel table while Melissa avoided his eyes entirely. Martin leaned toward me. "This is no longer about inheritance," he whispered. "It is about exposure." During lunch recess, Daniel approached me in the corridor, voice raw. "She played me." I held his gaze a long moment. "And you tried to play me." He had no answer. When proceedings resumed, Martin introduced Walter's protective clause formally into record, linking Daniel's guardianship petition and pressure tactics to attempted coercive conduct. The legal threshold was met before afternoon adjournment. The judge announced preliminary suspension of Daniel's inheritance rights pending final order. Suspended. The same quiet word now carrying public consequence. But the hardest blow came not from the bench. It came when Prairie Ridge's lead investor, subpoenaed unexpectedly, testified that projected inheritance from my estate had been cited during capital assurances. Daniel's shoulders dropped, as if something inside him finally understood the ground was gone. By the time court recessed, reporters from the local business paper had appeared in the hallway. Melissa slipped out a side door with her attorney. Daniel remained seated long after everyone rose. That night Martin called with news even he sounded impressed delivering. Melissa's charity board had placed her on immediate leave. Daniel's firm suspended his signing authority pending internal review. Financial punishment had begun before verdict. Yet Walter's deepest safeguards still had not been triggered. Martin told me final trust adjudication would occur Friday. And when the forfeiture executes, he said, there is a provision Daniel has never seen. I stood by the window watching snow begin to fall under the porch light. All this time, I had believed I was defending what remained of my life. Only then did I realize Walter had designed something far colder. Not defense. Judgment. And Friday, my son was going to hear it read aloud. Friday arrived with the kind of cold that makes courthouse steps ring beneath leather soles. I remember gripping the rail as I climbed, not from age, but from the strange awareness that something decades in the making was about to close. The final trust adjudication was held in the probate chamber rather than the larger courtroom, quieter and somehow more severe. No spectators this time beyond counsel, the trust officer, and Daniel seated alone at the far table. Melissa did not appear. Her attorney had submitted notice she would not contest separate findings. She had already chosen survival over alliance. Daniel looked smaller without her beside him. Martin placed a sealed addendum before the judge and whispered, "This is Walter's last move." I felt my pulse in my throat. The judge reviewed the record first. Attempted coercion established. Guardianship petition filed under misleading claims. Asset pressure linked to inheritance assumptions. Suspension of succession rights recommended. All of it stated in that measured judicial tone that makes ruin sound administrative. Then the addendum was opened. Even Martin had not shown me its full contents before that moment. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading a supplemental directive executed by Walter 12 years before his death. In the event forfeiture is triggered by coercive conduct from a direct heir, said heir shall lose not only inheritance rights but any governance role in family-held assets, trusts, and charitable appointments, with voting control permanently reassigned. Permanently. I heard Daniel inhale sharply. But there was more. The addendum activated what Walter called restorative disposition. 20% of what would have passed to Daniel was to fund a foundation supporting elderly financial abuse victims. The remaining interest stayed under my sole authority, with future succession redirected outside the offending line unless reinstated by my written election alone. My written election alone. The room seemed to go still around those words. Daniel rose halfway from his chair. "You are cutting me out entirely," he said, voice cracking despite himself. The judge looked over the bench. "Your father made that decision contingent upon your conduct. The record indicates you fulfilled the contingency." It was not anger that crossed Daniel's face. It was the shock of meeting consequence dressed in his father's handwriting. Then came the financial reckoning. The trust officer confirmed Daniel's claimed collateral expectations were void. Investor notices had already triggered default restructuring independent of my estate. His leverage was gone. His assumptions worthless. The legal architecture he thought he could exploit had folded around him instead. He turned toward me then, eyes wet in a way I had not seen since he was a boy. "Mom, please." One word. Please. It echoed oddly in that chamber. For a moment memory flickered. A scraped knee, at age 9. A graduation speech. The son I had loved without reservation. But love and surrender are not the same thing. I stood when the judge asked whether I intended to exercise reinstatement discretion. Every face turned toward me. I heard my own voice calm as winter. "No, Your Honor. I intend to exercise stewardship." Even Martin looked at me then with something like respect. Orders were entered before noon. By 1 o'clock Daniel's removal from the family charitable board was formal. By evening the business paper ran a brief notice on governance changes at Harper Holdings. Quiet public shame. Precise and lasting. Outside the courthouse Daniel caught up with me near the steps. "You chose the foundation over your own son." I looked at him for a long time. "No," I said. "You chose this when you asked for my signature and dismissed my judgment." He lowered his head. There was nothing left to argue with. I thought it was over. But 3 weeks later, seated at my dining room table reviewing foundation papers, Martin brought one final envelope recovered during Prairie Ridge disclosures. It was addressed to me in Melissa's hand, and inside was a statement that revealed the betrayal had begun long before Walter died. Melissa's letter was 3 pages long, written in a careful hand that looked almost graceful until one read what it contained. Martin slid it across my dining table without commentary, as though he understood some truths must enter a room unannounced. I unfolded the first page expecting accusation, perhaps self-justification. What I found instead was calculation preserved in ink. She wrote that Daniel's financial ambitions had begun years before Prairie Ridge, that while Walter was still alive there had been quiet conversations about advancing inheritance through restructuring family holdings. She claimed she had resisted at first. I did not believe that part. But farther down came something colder. Daniel had once asked whether Walter's health decline might create timing opportunities for estate transitions. I read that sentence 3 times. The room seemed to tilt, though I sat perfectly still. Not because I believed my son wished his father harm, but because he had allowed greed to think in places where love should have stood guard. Martin watched me carefully.
"There is more," he said.
There was. Melissa admitted she had pushed the guardianship strategy only after discovering Daniel concealed side borrowing from her. They had been betraying one another almost as long as they had been trying to outmaneuver me. A marriage built on mutual leverage. Somehow that revelation did not deepen my anger. It clarified it. Corruption had not entered my family through one dramatic act. It had seeped through 1,000. Tolerated compromises. That afternoon I walked through the house touching familiar things. Walter's study chair. The brass compass on his desk. The photograph of Daniel at 12 holding a fishing rod too big for him. I realized then the story could not end with my son's exclusion alone. Exclusion was punishment, but legacy required design. The next morning I met Martin to restructure everything. Harper Holdings would remain under my voting control. The charitable foundation would launch immediately, not after my death. We expanded its mission beyond elder financial abuse to include legal aid grants. Martin raised an eyebrow when I proposed endowing it with a larger share than Walter's addendum required. "You are turning consequence into architecture," he said. I smiled. I learned from Walter. Word spread quickly through the county. The foundation announcement in the paper reframed the scandal. What had begun as whispered family disgrace became, strangely, a story of reclamation. Women I barely knew sent letters. One widow drove 40 miles just to thank me after reading about the trust ruling. Something had shifted beyond my own household. Meanwhile, Daniel's world continued narrowing. His firm requested resignation rather than formal termination. Investors settled claims at losses that left him burdened for years. Not ruined beyond repair, but humbled into reality. Financial punishment, yes. But perhaps more severe was the social frost. Men who once courted his approval crossed streets without seeing him. Yet I took no pleasure in that. Justice can satisfy without becoming cruelty. Then one Sunday near Christmas, he came to my porch carrying no folder this time, only a fruitcake from the old bakery downtown, and an expression I recognized as exhaustion stripped of performance. We sat by the fire where Walter once read newspapers aloud. Daniel looked around the room, as if seeing his childhood through glass. "I thought money would make me secure," he said. It made me afraid. There was no request in his voice. No bargaining. Only a man speaking after illusion has burned out. I listened. When he left, he paused at the door. "Why did you not destroy me when you could have?" I answered honestly. "Because I wanted you to survive your lesson." After he drove away, I knew the ending had changed shape. This was no longer merely about exposing betrayal. It was about who held moral authority after exposure. Weeks later, at the Foundation's inaugural dinner, as donors gathered beneath chandeliers in the old Civic Hall, Martin leaned over and whispered that a reporter wanted to ask why I had redirected a fortune rather than reconcile privately. I looked across the room at the plaque bearing Walter's name and answered before he could ask. Because some signatures protect more when they refuse. And at that very moment, I saw Daniel standing in the back of the hall, uninvited, listening. Daniel did not approach me at the Foundation dinner. He stood near the back beneath the framed photographs of county benefactors, hands folded before him like a guest uncertain whether he belonged. I saw him listening as I spoke about stewardship, about how dignity can be protected when older voices are not dismissed as burdens. There was no bitterness in my remarks. That mattered. Revenge shouted grows small. Justice spoken plainly grows larger than the wound that birthed it. After the applause faded and donors drifted toward dessert tables, I found him outside beneath the portico, where winter wind pushed dry leaves across the stone steps. He looked thinner than he had months earlier, the expensive confidence, once worn like a tailored coat, stripped down to something more human. "I came to hear what you built from all this," he said. I studied him in the yellow light. "And?" I asked. He exhaled. "I came thinking you took everything from me. Now I think I tried to take everything from myself." It was not an apology polished for effect. It arrived rough, almost ashamed. We stood in silence a moment, hearing traffic move beyond the square. Then he reached into his coat and handed me an envelope. Inside was a notarized renunciation of any future challenge to the trust or foundation, signed voluntarily. Martin later called it unnecessary. I understood it differently. It was the first honest signature my son had given in years. Yet the true reckoning came. Weeks later, at our family Christmas dinner, the first hosted again in my own dining room with the mahogany table polished until it glowed. A smaller gathering now. Fewer people. Better people. Martin attended. So did two widows helped by the foundation. Daniel arrived early carrying a box of old ornaments from his attic, including one Walter made with him in grade school. We decorated the tree in almost awkward peace. During dinner, conversation turned to the foundation's first legal aid grant, and one guest asked how I had known when to resist family pressure. Daniel looked down at his plate. I set my fork aside and answered more for him than for anyone. The day someone asks for your obedience while dismissing your judgment, they are not seeking help. They are seeking control. The room went quiet. Daniel lifted his eyes. There was pain there, but also recognition. After dessert, he asked privately if we could talk in Walter's study. The old room smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco, though Walter had been gone nearly 2 years. Daniel stood before the desk where all this, in some strange way, had begun. "I used to think you won because you had a better lawyer," he said. "Now I know you won because you never surrendered authority over who you were." Then he said something I had not expected to hear in this lifetime. "I was ashamed of needing your inheritance. I was more ashamed of fearing your opinion." The irony nearly made me smile. I walked to Walter's desk drawer and removed the fountain pen Daniel once gave his father on Father's Day. I set it before him. "Keep it," I said, "as a reminder what signatures are supposed to mean." He looked confused. I held his gaze and gave him the line that had lived in me since the courthouse, but had waited for this room. "You said you needed my signature, not my opinion. Turns out, Daniel, my opinion was the one thing that saved this family's name." He covered his face a moment, not weeping, simply absorbing. That was the true payoff, I think. Not his humiliation, his awakening. Yet the world still delivered its harsher verdicts. Melissa, facing civil exposure, settled claims and left the state. Her social standing never recovered. Daniel rebuilt slowly in a smaller advisory practice under strict oversight. The consequences remained visible. Financial, legal, reputational. Clear. Lasting. Earned. And me? I held every asset, every vote, every decision Walter intended me to hold. Fully. Publicly. Undisputed. As Daniel left that night, he paused at the front door and said, almost with wonder, "I spent all those months trying to get your signature. I never realized I should have been asking for your wisdom." I watched the porch light fall across the snow after he drove away and felt no loose ends inside me. The betrayers had been exposed. They had paid. The legacy stood under my hand alone. And for the first time since that Sunday at my table, I understood power is not the right to control others. It is the refusal to let anyone reduce you. Spring came early that year, and with it came the kind of light that makes old houses look forgiven. By March, the Harper Family Foundation had funded its first 6 legal defense cases, and my name, once nearly reduced to a signature line, now appeared engraved on the brass donor wall at the Civic Hall beside Walter's. But the true ending did not arrive in ceremony. It arrived in public reckoning. A county business journal released its final investigative report into Prairie Ridge, and for the first time, everything whispered in hallways was printed in black ink. Misrepresented collateral assumptions, improper reserve diversions, attempted undue influence connected to trust proceedings. Melissa's role was named. Daniel's failures were named. The article spread faster than scandal usually does in towns where people pretend not to read scandal. By noon, the charity circuit that had once embraced Melissa closed its doors to her entirely. Board invitations vanished. Speaking engagements evaporated. Her reputation, built over years of polished appearances, did not survive one truthful week. She later settled civil exposure at significant personal cost and left Illinois quietly.
No dramatic exit.
Just the colder punishment of social erasure. Daniel's consequences were different and perhaps harder. He was not destroyed, but stripped down to honesty. His development ambitions were gone. The investors restructured without him. His old firm's name disappeared from the brass plate downtown. He spent months unwinding debt and years rebuilding trust in a smaller practice where every client knew his story before hiring him. That was justice, too. Not annihilation. Accountability with memory attached. And through it, all the assets they once reached for never left my control. The house remained mine. Harper Holdings remained under my vote alone. The trust amendments were finalized permanently. No appeal. No challenge. No hidden backdoor. Martin said few women in probate history had emerged from coercion with more authority than they began with. I told him I only kept what should never have been questioned. The final confrontation came not in court, but on Mother's Day. Daniel arrived carrying a small wooden box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the fountain pen I had given back to him in Walter's study, now restored and engraved with new words on the barrel. Your opinion built the legacy. I ran my thumb across the engraving and said nothing for a long moment. Then he handed me one more document. Transfer papers donating a portion of his remaining personal holdings to the foundation voluntarily. This time, he said, I wanted my signature to mean repair. I signed the acceptance beside him at the dining table where he once pushed those first papers toward me. The symmetry was so complete it almost felt written by fate. But the moment that gave me the deepest satisfaction came later that afternoon when our extended family gathered for dinner and a niece asked how the foundation began. Daniel answered before I could. Because I mistook my mother for someone to manage, he said. And she taught me the cost of that mistake.
No excuses. No revisión.
Public truth from the one who once tried to bury it. That was the final exposure. Complete. Irreversible. Human. After everyone left, I sat alone beneath Walter's portrait with evening sun across the floorboards and understood the story had ended exactly where it should. The betrayers had been uncovered in law, in money, in reputation, and in conscience. They had paid in every currency they once worshipped, and I had not merely survived their scheme. I had transformed it into something larger than revenge. I had turned attempted theft into legacy, humiliation into authority, betrayal into a structure that would outlive all of us. Before bed, I opened Walter's old cedar box one last time and placed inside the original and signed papers Daniel had once brought me. Yellow tabs still marking where they wanted my hand. I smiled at the irony. Those papers had meant to erase me. Instead, they became the beginning of my greatest act of power. And if there was one truth I carried from all of it, it was this. They came for my signature believing age made me weak. They left with forfeited fortunes, broken reputations, and a lesson written in court records. I kept the house. I kept the legacy. I kept my name. And in the end, the woman they tried to silence became the final authority over everything they hoped to take.